Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. I am honored and humbled to welcome Erica Gies to the Water Shelf Podcast. Erica is an independent journalist covering science and the environment from Victoria, British Columbia, and San Francisco, California. Her work appears in the New York Times, Scientific American, Nature, Ensia, The Economist, bioGraphic, National Geographic, and other outlets. She is the author of the recently published and well-distributed book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, published by University of Chicago Press in 2022. I say well-distributed because during our recent vacation in London over the holidays, I found Erica's book on the shelf of Waterstone's booksellers, so I can confirm that it is has a well-deserved international audience. Erica, I am thrilled to meet you and speak with you about this exciting book.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I think my first question is just talking about where this book came from. Who do you consider to be the intended audience of your book? Or another way to ask this might be, who do you most want to read this book?
I think most authors say everybody, and that would be my answer as well. I am a journalist who writes for a lot of mainstream publications, and so I do consider my audience to be the general public. And I felt like, I've been covering climate change for more than 20 years. I've been focused pretty explicitly on water for more than 15 years. And I felt like there was a significant piece missing in the conversation. So with climate change, I was there when the denialism was happening, and then the shift to, well, maybe it's happening, but humans aren't causing it. And now most people accept that humans are causing it. But in the process, that message has been really oversimplified to, we have to get off fossil fuels. And of course, that's incredibly important. But the land use component has really been neglected in that, and you hear almost nothing about it. And it's not just the carbon that's stored in landscapes, but also the water cycle, which is a very critical plays a critical role. Water is a greenhouse gas. Water vapor is the primary way that the planet cools itself. And we've just dramatically altered the water cycle on a global scale. And that is the source of a lot of the problems that we're having with water, or it is a primary source, along with climate change and a couple of other things. So I felt like people just didn't know that. I'm not hearing about it from other journalists. I'm not hearing about it in policy conversations. And so, my work is generally to find science that I think is important, that I think is being overlooked, and to try to bring that into the light. And so that was my goal with this book.
Fantastic. We were talking just a bit before starting the recording about the title of your book. I found it so striking, alliterative. It really captures your attention. How did the title come about? Water Always Wins, and also is there a sense of competition? Who's water winning over, so to speak? Maybe.
Yeah, the title came from a line that I wrote in my book proposal, and my agent really seized upon that, and she said, "Oh, that would make a great title." And I'm glad I listened to her, because I think it works, and I think it does capture people's imagination. Water is its own entity with agency. Water has power and relationships. And by that, I mean relationships with soil and rock and microbes and plants and beavers and people. And so sooner or later, water does always win. Water does what water is going to do. And that doesn't mean that we have to lose. But if we put ourselves in in a fight with water, if we're trying to control water, then we are going to lose at some point. And in fact, we're seeing that increasingly often. Whereas if we can change our perspective, our relationship with water to one of respect and collaboration, then we can win too.
I really like that. Before we get into the book, I was wondering, is there a particular book or books on your water shelf, so to speak, that inspired you either to write Water Always Wins or inspired you while you were writing your book?
Yeah, I think, what inspired me to write the book were some of my journalism stories and speaking with researchers who are working on this and just feeling like, sometimes you hear basically the slow water projects that I'm talking about in my book are a form of nature-based solutions. And those are gaining prominence or gaining some status. But I think a lot of people, I still hear water experts, water engineers saying, well, that's nice, but it can't be a significant part of the solution. And, that's a fundamental understanding of the state of the science and of scale. And so that was something that I really wanted to address with this book. In the process of writing, while I was doing some research, I found a couple of books that really had a strong impact on me, and I mentioned them in the book, in the text. One is, I think it's called Holding Back the Inland Sea by John Kelly. And it was written in the 80s, and it's basically about the Central Valley being a giant wetland, 400-mile long seasonal wetland, and the incredible effort it took to ultimately control the Sacramento and the San Joaquin and turn them into the very channelized, levied off water canals that they are today, as opposed to, really strong living rivers. In the case of the Sacramento, it took about 75 years of trial and error for people to get it to the state it is in now. And then the other book that really struck me was also about trying to control a river, and it was called Rising Tide by John M. Barry. And he's an historian at a university in Louisiana, and the river he was talking about was the Mississippi. He's really focused on the taming of the Mississippi River, the way in which it was levied over decades, and the fights in the 19th century that led to that outcome, and that ultimately could have led to a more natural, river-friendly approach, but ultimately lost out.
Those are fascinating sources, and I always think when I'm visiting the Central Valley, we now have a much fuller understanding of the immense change that occurred in that area, and the picturing it an inland sea is something when you're flying over, just thinking about that is intense. Let's get into the book itself. What would you say is the thesis or the central argument for Water Always Wins?
Yeah, I traveled around the world to many countries: China, India, Iraq, England, Kenya, Peru, and places in the United States and Canada. And in all these places, I found people who were realizing the futility of the kind of dominant culture's approach to water control. And in that lens, basically, in the dominant culture, by which I mean sort of settler colonialism, which has been expanded around the world via, most recently, capitalism, water is either a commodity if it's scarce, or a threat if we're worried about flooding. It's a thing, and it's a thing that we want to control. But in all these places I met indigenous peoples, farmers, landscape architects, people who lived closer to the land or took a very kind of observant approach to the land and understood that water is part of a complex system, that water has all these complex relationships. And a lot of our single focus interventions, like, we're worried about flooding, let's build a wall, let's build a levee. We're worried about scarcity, let's build a pipe and bring it in from somewhere else. Those single focus solutions that put human needs as most paramount ignore these complex systems and therefore damage them. And when they're damaged, they are no longer supporting us in the way that we have become accustomed. And, our dominant economic system, all of these are externalities. They call them ecosystem services. So a floodplain's ability to absorb water and release it slowly into the river and supply the river throughout the dry season. It's wetlands' ability to clean pollution from water, to form the base of the food chain that supplies the fish that we eat. All of those things aren't typically counted in our economic system, and so therefore we're able to damage them without paying a financial cost. And the reason that we're having so many flood and drought disasters more recently, aside from climate, which is altering the water cycle as well, is that we have interfered with these natural processes to such a great degree. And, before we had a lot of natural buffers, so we could control this river, but, we had these extra wetlands upstream that were maybe helping to absorb the water. But now we don't have that buffer. So a few statistics. Globally, we have drained or filled as much as 87% of the world's wetlands, dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's large rivers. And just since 1992, the area of pavement covered, that our city footprints have doubled. So I'd say the basic premise of the book is that it's not just climate change causing these water disasters, but also our development choices. These are urban sprawl, industrial agriculture, forestry, and also the very kind of concrete control-oriented way that we try to manage water. And so the good news about that is there's a lot we can do in our own communities with our neighbors to make ourselves much more resilient to these water extremes, also to reduce fire risk, because fire and water are connected through plants and climate. And so the people I met around the world are all doing this in different ways, and part of what I call the slow water movement. And they are seeking to return space for water in these places that we've eradicated with our development. So wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, forests. And there are a few kind of common features in slow water, if I could discuss those briefly.
Please.
Yeah, so every place is unique. Every place has its own unique geology, ecology, and culture. So slow water approaches are unique to each place. They're meant to also invoke the slow food movement, which also looks to work within the local ecology, climate, and culture. But they do have some common approaches. So they use systems thinking rather than that single focus problem solving. They are distributed across the landscape rather than centralized. So if you think about that 87% of the world's wetlands that we've eradicated, you start to understand why water needs places all along the watershed to slow again. Slow water is ideally local, helping us to understand the local water cycle and availability and work within it. And, I'm from California, and that's really anathema. We're all about moving water long distances. But in fact, it's also an environmental justice issue. So I think, common sense kind of explains if you build a levee along one side of the river, you're cutting off the river's access to its floodplain there. And so you're raising the water level in the river. And that increases flood risk on a nearby community who perhaps can't afford a levee. But dams are also environmental justice issues. A 40-year survey found that globally, dams brought water to 20% of the world's population, but decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. And, the people who receive that water may seem like the lucky ones. But in fact, there's a field called sociohydrology, which looks at the relationship between water and people, which for a long time, hydrologists didn't really consider that. They just looked at the flows in the river and the natural system. But there's something called the reservoir effect. And basically, more supply just increases demand. And we've seen this again and again and again all over the world. It's like when you have gridlock on the freeway, so you build more lanes, and then people think, oh, it'll be easy to drive. And so suddenly then you have more gridlock again. And, we've seen this in California a lot. Like, we've brought in all this water from other places, and the demand has just gone up and up. Like, the more water you bring to an area, the more you can expand agriculture, the more you can expand housing and industry. And then you just have a greater number of people who are living in this water scarce area and who are reliant upon this fundamentally unreliable supply. And I'll just say the last thing about slow water is that it involves the community. It's community facing. So in some places I went in the world, like Peru and India, local people were hands-on actually helping to build and manage these systems. And then in other places, maybe it's more educational. Like, if you have an industrial site that goes away and it's right in the middle of the city, right alongside the river, and you clean it up, maybe you turn that into a public park so that it can flood when necessary, but you don't have a lot of damage. And then maybe there's signage which explains to the public, this is what's happening on the site. This is how water interacts with the land. So when you have these small distributed projects all throughout the watershed, you have a lot more chance of people coming into contact with them. And so that's what I mean by community facing.
It's an amazing, large, detailed, and an important aspect to reviewing how we manage water. It's a tremendous thesis, and I appreciate you explaining it. And I also wanted to talk just real quickly about one of my favorite attributes to your book is how you explain this incredibly important view of how to do water management in the future. And it's through all these stories. And obviously you're a journalist by trade, so telling stories is fundamental to your work. But did you structure it around all these various stories all across the world?
Yeah, I think I'm a person who's always been interested in the world, and I've done a fair bit of traveling in my reporting. And so I kind of already have that global perspective. And one of the things that hit me really early on in my traveling was just, when you live in one place your whole life, and then you go to the other side of the world, you find here are people doing things radically differently than we do them. And we just thought our way was the way. But in fact, their way seems perfectly good and has, maybe drawbacks, but also benefits that our way doesn't have. So that really got me interested in, what are people's approaches in different places, and what can we learn from them when we look at them in that kind of big picture. And then in terms of writing this book specifically, I was definitely wanting to provide, like I said, every slow water innovation is unique to its place. But I wanted to give enough of a range so that anyone, anywhere could find an example that might resonate with them. So I wanted to show places that were suffering with water scarcity, and maybe because their glaciers were melting, or maybe because their area had been deforested. I wanted to show places that were dealing with flooding, maybe because they had urban sprawl and there was, thousands of miles of concrete and no way for the water to get into the ground. So I was trying to find examples of all these different types of projects. And then I also wanted to give a kind of distribution around the world to show that this is a global movement and there are good examples of people taking it to scale in places that you wouldn't expect. And so in some cases, I had already been to places and knew about work. So that was the case with China and India. In other places, I actively went looking for good examples. So I wanted an example from the African continent. I wanted an example from South America. So I specifically went looking for the Kenya story, the Peru story. I wasn't able to make it to Australia, which I really regret, because Australia and water really have a lot to say. But you can't go everywhere. And then once I had these various stories, it was a struggle to think about, like, how can I put these together in a cohesive narrative that will really kind of carry the reader along. And so I did two things to try to do that. And one of them was really looking at water as an entity with agency and studying water's relationship with different entities. And I wanted to kind of make that make sense to a general person. And so I chose to go with kind of a chronological arrangement. So first, water's rock and soil and the underground, just sort of geologic time. And then I have a chapter that looks at microbes and, the hyperrheic zone, which is an exciting thing to learn about. And then I've got the beavers, and then I've got a couple of chapters on older human cultures, and then modern humans, and then future humans. And so that's how I kind of tried to structure it. And then the other thing too is when you have a book like this where you're meeting so many different experts and characters, water detectives from around the world, I feel like as a reader, you need some kind of common thread that's going to pull you through. So, because, you get attached to one person and then, chapter's over and now you've got some new people to meet. So it really made sense to kind of make myself that character, which I was a little reluctant to do. But it was the most natural way because I'm traveling to all these places, I'm meeting all these people. And really, curiosity is fundamental to this book. And the people in my book are all taking a very curious approach to water, asking, what does water want? And what can we do for water? And so putting myself as kind of the narrative link also allowed me to learn along with the reader. Well, what is water doing here? And why would humans try to do this thing? And so that learning process became sort of the through line in the book.
Yeah, I can totally see it. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it works really beautifully. I think also kind of capturing or them into a cohort of the water detectives. I love that catchy name. It was, used it consistently through. And I really got that for all these practitioners around the world, nature-based solutions as well as just the term slow water that you've explained. Are there any other important terms to the slow water movement? I was thinking the one that occurred to me was permaculture, kind of the holistic approach to landscape. But I was wondering if there was any other terminologies, terms that you think are important in slow water.
Yeah, I mean, permaculture is also seeking to slow water on the land to heal water cycles. And there's some really great communities of people who are doing that all over the world. One kind of clearinghouse of information that I've discovered is a website called Water Stories. And the guy who founded that has done this work. He's sort of apprenticed with experts around the world in Zimbabwe and Austria. And now he teaches these classes and he arranges these educational sessions, and he's really just keen on sharing this information. So that's a great place to go to learn about that. In terms of my book, I think, slow water was the big one, and the book's edition in China is actually called Slow Water, which I really like. And then there's one other term which is a little more niche, but I really became fascinated by it, and I've had a bunch of readers tell me that it really grabbed them as well, so I'll share that. There's something called the hyperrheic zone, which is in a stream or river, it's an area underneath the stream bed, and it's not the groundwater, it's not the aquifer, it's an ecotone, a zone in between, and it comes from a Greek word hyporheic, which means underflow. And basically the river is also moving downstream through that sediment and rock, but orders of magnitude more slowly than it does at the surface. And the hyporheic zone is really critical to all kinds of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling. And a lot of little microbuddies live down there. And, we've been learning more about our gut and how if we don't have a diverse gut microbiome, we are sick. And it's the same for a stream. If a stream doesn't have healthy critters in the hyporeic zone, it really has very little hope of being a healthy, self-sustaining system. And this is a big problem, particularly in cities, because we bury a lot of creeks and streams and pipes, and the ones that do remain on the surface, we haven't left enough space for slow water, so they tend to flood because all the rain flow runs off into them immediately. And then we straighten them, and then that creates fast water and scours it, and then we put up, sandbags or concrete, creating even faster water. And basically, it removes all of this soft material where the hyporeic zone exists. And so there was a really cool project in Seattle that I write about in my book, where they were having urban flooding for this creek, and they realized that the hyporeic zone was completely missing. And so they rebuilt it, and they repopulated it by inoculating it with wild critters from a wilder stream. And it was, as far as I know, a first in the world attempt to do this. And it was incredibly successful, and it's starting to be replicated elsewhere. And I could say a lot more about that project. It's super cool. But people could also read about it in Water Always Wins, Chapter 3.
As they should. That was an incredibly revelatory chapter to me. I had no idea that rivers and streams had guts, so to speak, and that was just really eye-opening. And the other eye-opening chapter, I think it's the following chapter, Chapter 4, is on beavers. That chapter blew my mind. I had no idea the broad extent of the beavers' influence, the water engineers that, basically worked with landscapes, but also changed the landscapes in a very massive way. And now, because they're missing, or they're trying to be reintroduced by some of the detectives to try to reintroduce that. I don't know if you want to speak a bit to that. The beaver chapter was incredible.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think a lot of people know that beavers were hunted for their fur, primarily, for other parts as well. And really, the trappers came ahead of settlers in North America. And so by the time settlers arrived, beavers were largely gone. And so our baseline of what we think North America is like is already radically altered from what it was. And it's estimated that at one point, 10% of North America was beaver-created wetlands. And so with their removal, we have a much drier continent. And, we think of the West as a dry place where streams only run in the winter. But historically, a lot of streams actually ran year-round. And partly it was because of beavers and their wetlands. Partly it was because rivers had access to their floodplains. Grasslands were healthy. They've been overgrazed. Forests were healthy. They've been clear cut. And so, Brock Dillman, who's a beaver activist, he calls it the age of drainage, like 500 years of just drying out the continent. And the killing of beavers was really the first step in that. And so, people have realized beavers were almost completely extirpated from North America in the turn of the 20th century. And so California at that point passed a law to protect them because they were endangered. But then, people tend to think that beavers cause problems because they cut trees and they cause flooding. But, in the UK, people use beavers to prevent flooding, and it's because their dams slow water. So when you have a big storm, that water is still going downstream, but over a longer period of time. And so you don't have that same high flood peak that's going to flood neighboring towns. And in the Western US, in the mid 20th century in California and Idaho, people started realizing, beavers do a lot of important work to heal stream systems and to make them hospitable for fish. And so people started relocating beavers into headwaters at that point. And in some of those roadless areas, they actually use parachutes to deliver the beavers quite successfully.
I love that too. That was great.
Yeah, it's really fun to think of them parachuting in. But more recently, Washington State has been a real leader in the reintroduction of beavers. And California, just in the last year, created 5 state-level positions with California Fish and Wildlife to facilitate the return of beavers. And, you know, as our snowpack melts and we don't have that source of storing water into the dry season, beavers in their ponds can play a really important role in helping to, because, you know, they're moving that water underground. And once it's underground, it just moves downstream much more slowly. So it extends the availability. And that's a really important thing. The surface and groundwater are linked, and our groundwater is very overexploited. And that's a lot of the problems that we're having with surface waters because we're not taking care of our groundwater as well. And I'll just add that beavers are really important for fires as well, because as I said, we've really done so much to desiccate the landscape. And that is part of the reason why, and the way that industrial forestry happens and dries out forests, that's a big factor in the fires. It's not just climate change. And so beavers create fire breaks. Typically, if left to their own devices, once they have babies, they'll grow up a little bit and then they'll move on, they'll make their own dams. And so you'll have a string of dams all down a river. And they're raising the water table beyond the river itself, which brings the water into where it's available to plants. And so the plants are less dried out and less likely to burn. So they're really important for that as well.
Right there, 2 of the amazing 10 chapters of the book. I strongly urge everybody to check out every aspect of the chapter of this book, because there's so many amazing stories. Pulling back a little bit, Erica, into kind of talking about the slow water movement in general. It seems to me that one of the challenges of the slow water movement kind of moving forward that you document is scale. Kind of namely, how do you scale up all of these multiple nature-based solutions implemented around the world by water detectives to sustain a global population that exists of, you know, approaching, I guess, 9 billion or so. So you engage this challenge at multiple points in your book. I saw you directly pointing to this issue, but I was wondering if you could speak to that challenge and how your book specifically addresses and how the slow water movement in general is trying to tackle this challenge.
Yeah, I think I was really looking for examples where people were taking this to scale on some level. So, for example, in Peru, it's a very water scarce country and becoming more so as their glaciers melt, which they have relied on for summer water. And so the water managers there passed a series of laws that require water utilities to take some of the money from water bills and invest it in upstream watersheds. So this is, before it was considered corruption if somebody invested outside of the utility area, and now it's required because they understand that the water comes from the mountains and that they rely on the people in the mountains to have practices that will make the water available into the dry season, particularly as the glaciers melt. So a couple of the things they've invested in are a rare high altitude wetland called Bofedales or cushion bog. And those are under threat in various ways. So they're trying to invest that money in protecting them and restoring them where possible. And then there's a 1,400-year-old technique used by Andean farmers, which takes water from the wet season, funnels it into these natural infiltration basins, where it then moves underground and emerges later in springs, where they then harvest it into the dry season to be able to water their crops. And for the cities down below, then that water goes underground again and ultimately reaches the rivers that supply them. And so some scientists studying this found that this system can delay water availability from 2 weeks to 8 months, with an average delay of about 45 days. So that is a really significant benefit into the dry season. Anyway, that's a scale. In China, they have sponge cities, which has become a national movement because it's championed by Xi Jinping. It's being rolled out in more than 500 cities. And a lot of cities around the world are starting to do this in various ways. In the United States, it's called low impact design. And the idea is to make our cities more permeable, which reduces flooding and also captures more local rainwater on site to make it available into the dry season. And this is just something I saw again and again. You know, cities, first they flood, and then they don't have, you know, they rush that water away, and then they need water later. And so they're bringing it in from somewhere else. So they're pumping groundwater. So it's really, really short-sighted, single focus management. One thing I'll just say about China is that there are still big floods in China that kill people, hundreds of people in some cases. And so I've seen a couple of headlines like, does sponge cities even work? And it is that question of scale. You know, even though the Sponge City program is incredibly ambitious, it's still only about like 5 square miles of a city that covers 1,000 square miles. So you understand why it's not going to prevent flooding in this paved over city where the water has no place to go. And in terms of scaling, I think these ideas are gaining awareness and popularity. They're being deployed all over the world, increasingly so, and a lot of cities, it's part of their discussion. But there is, as one of my sources said, gray infrastructure has a 150-year head start. So while there's a growing body of science and economic studies that show that these projects work really well, they provide multiple benefits, they're very cost effective, much cheaper than gray infrastructure. They can maintain themselves if you can get the natural systems working properly. So there's still an educational component to bring decision makers up to speed. Like there's still that attitude of, well, that's nice, but you know, it can't really be the solution. And so, you know, the more people are able to roll this out and make this the norm of how we approach water and how we relate to water, the bigger impact it will have. And what I think is really exciting about it is that every little bit helps. The communities that do these projects, they see local improvement and impacts and they enjoy those. And then maybe their neighbors see that. And so they want to do it. So every little bit helps, and cumulatively it can do a lot. And we're still kind of in the early stages of this movement, but it's been around for at least 10 years. It's growing, and hopefully, you know, will continue to grow faster because it really does deal with a lot of things at once. You know, we hear a lot about the climate crisis. We hear a lot about the water crisis. We sometimes hear about the biodiversity crisis. All of these things are linked to how we manage the landscape. And largely, a lot of the problems we're having is because we have so dramatically destroyed much of the land on Earth. Like 75% of land on Earth is significantly altered by humans and is, you know, having trouble conducting its natural functions. And so I think there tends to be this sort of single focus, like, you know, humans are most important. We have to put humans first. We have to do this, you know, very straight ahead thing to solve the problem. But if we can step back a little bit and respect our non-human neighbors, we can understand that, in fact, they are doing a lot for us, and a lot of things will go better for us if we can think, you know, from a more community-minded perspective. And, you know, that can sound a little woo-woo to the dominant culture, but I think it's just a sign of how far we've gotten away from understanding our kind of place in the world. And, you know, I think it should be obvious to people that what we're doing isn't working. We're having failures increasingly often in terms of these crazy fires, you know, big floods and really intense droughts. And so, you know, the wisdom that I was able to gather from these water detectives all over the world really point toward a better path.
And talking about that better path, which I hope we certainly are on. Where do you see, kind of pulling back to your book and other books and other maybe even movements out there? Where do you see your book on the water shelf, so to speak? I know most of our bookshelves are in alphabetical order, but if you pretend they're not, what books would you like to see next to yours, or that pair very well with yours?
So I think I'm really interested in books that deal with changing our dominant culture's relationship with nature and water, because I do feel like we've really gone astray, and that is the source of so many of our problems. So a book I really loved, which many people really love, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And she's an Indigenous person who's also a botanist, a plant scientist. And she does a really great job of kind of layering her Indigenous perspective with the science. So she's kind of talking to people about her culture and her beliefs in a way that people from the dominant culture can hopefully understand. And I think she does that really, really powerfully. So I really like that book. Another book I really love is Mark Ericks's book, The Dreamt Land. And Mark Ericks is from the Central Valley. His last name is spelled Arax. And it came out, I don't know, a year or two before my book. And it's really focused on the Central Valley and the history of agriculture and water development in the Central Valley. And it's not a slow water solutions book by any means. But what I really like about it is that it shows how again and again the San Joaquin Valley ran out of water, had used up all of its available water, used political power and machinations to get these really large industrial projects to bring them more water, and then again exploited all that water, and then started petitioning for more water. And it's going on, and even to this day.
I want to just close the interview just with a question about how you feel like your book's been received. I would mention at the beginning about finding it in London and being so thrilled about that. And you mentioned the Chinese version and the title was Slow Water. Are there other places the book is popping up, not just in countries, but in classrooms, any place like that?
Yeah, I've been really happily surprised by how enthusiastic people seem to be about the book. And in particular, I've been getting a ton of speaking engagements and
Wonderful.
requests. And a lot of these have been at water conferences like the American Water Resources Association or the Illinois Floodplain Management Group or River Restoration Northwest. I just spoke at the Colorado Water Congress. And so it's interesting to see that these folks who you might think are coming from sort of the standard engineering background, and in fact they are really open to this message of, to the point where like I am their keynote speaker at their conference, which it surprised me, and I find that a really encouraging and hopeful sign. And I was recently asked to give some video commentary to it's an international body that's trying to think about how we can revalue water to prioritize some of these multifaceted goals that I was talking about in terms of climate, biodiversity, and water and fire. So yeah, it's interesting. I said that I wrote it for regular people, and I have gotten some of that. And I have spoken to Rotary groups and Sierra clubs and things like that. Also, a lot of water experts have been really interested. And so, yeah, I find that encouraging.
I find it very encouraging. It doesn't surprise me at all. And hopefully we get a chance to meet in person at one of these conferences in the future. I just wanted to say thank you so much. for being on the Water Shelf. You're only my second interview, and I deeply appreciate your willingness to come on and tell us about this wonderful and again, very, very well-received book, an important book showing us a different path for water. And I think, as you just described, there's a tremendous amount of interest that is going to be ongoing. So thank you so much for being on the Water Shelf podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's fun conversation.
Oh, I enjoyed it immensely. We've been speaking with Erica Gies about her recently published book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge, published by University of Chicago Press, 2022, available wherever you can find books. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Water Shelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.